I'm in Anqing in Anhui province, and this is the city where I lived for 1 year when I first came to China way back in 2012. I've got a lot of really great memories from this city. I actually come back to visit semi-regularly, but the last time I was here I think was in early 2021, so it's been about 3 years now. For today's run, I haven't got an exact route planned. Instead, I'm just going to try to use my memory to run to some of the places that I used to go to when I lived here and see how they've changed. Okay? Let's go. At the very end of August in 2012, I touched down in Anqing, Anhui, to begin what would end up being an almost decade-long stay in China. During those years, people often asked me, why did you come to China? It seems like a simple question, but it's one that I find quite difficult to answer. That's because, to paraphrase Kierkegaard, life is lived forward, but we must try to understand it backwards. So whenever we remember our lives, we inevitably create stories to explain what we did and how certain things came to be. The problem is not that these stories are not true. The problem is that the story came after the events. You weren't actually living out the story at the time when the events were happening. So, no matter how honest you try to be, the story is ultimately a creation, an attempt to give order and meaning to past events. What's more, an entirely accurate story of one's life would take as long to tell as it did to live. So we must summarise days, weeks, months and years into a few paragraphs or even just a single sentence. In so doing, we are choosing only the one story we want to tell, when there are likely many true stories that could be told. It started to rain, but I actually don't mind too much because it's really hot and humid, so hopefully the rain will help to cool it down a little bit. With regards to my coming to China, there is one story I can tell about it being because of my desire to travel and learn about different cultures. I travelled a lot in my early 20s and spent extended periods abroad. Not only was it really fun, but it also had a big impact on me, changing the way I thought about the world. I became interested in travelling after working in an international boarding school. I met people, both students and other staff members, from all over the world. I often spoke to them about the life and culture in their home countries. I became especially interested in cultures that were very different from my own. There was something fascinating to me about the idea that there were places in the world where people lived lives that were truly different from mine. Even when I wasn't travelling, I would often listen to foreign music, watch foreign films, and read books about other cultures. The street behind me is Beijingjie, which has almost nothing except for lots of amazing small restaurants and takeaways. When I used to live in Anqing, I'd come here maybe 4 or 5 times a week to eat food. I long had an idea about going travelling again, and so when I learnt about opportunities in China, it really appealed to me. I knew that Chinese culture would be very different from British culture, and that made the idea of going there really exciting. What's more, even though I had a good general knowledge about world history and world cultures, I actually knew very little about China, and so that made me want to go there even more, as I knew I'd encounter lots of new and interesting things. And so, I decided to go, thinking that it would likely be a 1-year working holiday, not unlike other working holidays I'd had in the past. Of course, it ended up being so much more. Back when I used to live in Anqing, there was an acupuncturist that used to work out of that garage just behind me. And I remember joking with a friend of mine that he might be some amazing martial arts master, because you'll know if you've ever watched any of those old kung fu films, that it's often the little old doctor or somebody like that who turns out to be the most amazing martial artist. Well, I got speaking to him one day, and he actually was a former martial arts master. He used to coach either a local or perhaps even provincial wushu team, and he had lots of old photos from competitions that his students had entered and won. So I asked him if he could teach me, and we did start training together. We used to go down to the river in the mornings, and we do some weapon stuff and some other wushu things. But unfortunately, he worked really, really long hours, and so the only free time he had was at 6 a.m. And for me, that was a little bit too early. So after going for some time, I decided that I couldn't go anymore, which I kind of regret because it would have been cool to keep training with him. But nevertheless, it was a great experience. But there is another story I can tell about how I went to China in order to test out teaching as a career. I went to university a bit later in my life and graduated in my mid-20s. Despite being older than most graduates, I was still unsure about what I wanted to do as a career. However,
I had been interested in teaching for quite some time.
I used to live not far from here, and just there on the path behind me, there was a guy who each night would sell jianjiaozi, fried dumplings, and they were really, really good, so I'd often get them for dinner. And I remember one day I came to him and I asked him for some jiaozi, and he asked me how many. And before I could answer, he said to me 14. And I remember thinking, that's a bit of an unusual number, but still 14 seems about right. So I said, yeah, okay, 14. And then I walked away to buy a drink. And when I came back, he had a huge box of jiaozi for me. And it turned out he hadn't said 14, he'd actually said 40, which is a lot of jiaozi to eat. But nevertheless, I ate them all because they were really good.
When I was growing up, my dad ran a martial arts school, and I trained in various martial arts from a young age. From about 16 years old, my dad started to let me teach classes in his school. Firstly, just the children's classes, but as I got older and more experienced, I also taught the adult classes. I really enjoyed this, and the experience gave me a lot of confidence. Later, one of my first ever full-time jobs was working in the international boarding school I mentioned earlier. I lived in the school and was responsible for leading activities with students, coaching sports teams, and teaching basic IT classes. I found that I had a knack for explaining complex things in ways that were easy to understand, and I found real value in helping young people to improve. So when, after finishing university, I learnt about teaching opportunities in China, it seemed like the perfect chance for me to both use the skills and experience I had and test out whether or not I'd like to pursue teaching as a career. And so, I found a job in a middle school and set off. I discovered that I really did love teaching, and it became a valuable and rewarding career for me for almost 10 years, and something that I may well do again in the future.
That is where you can get a ferry to the other side of the river. I've done it a couple of times. The last time I did it, I think it cost me 2 kwai, but I can't remember. Also, the last time I did it, there wasn't a lot on the other side. I seem to remember it was mostly just farms, and there was a small marketplace and a few restaurants. I wonder what it's like today.
On the other hand, there is also a story about how I came to China, which relies almost entirely on serendipity. In 2011, my former flatmate and good friend went to teach English in China. I stayed in touch with him, and he told me about the country and his life there. One day, in the early summer of 2012, we were talking on the phone. I was telling him about how I still couldn't decide what I wanted to do as a career, and I wasn't impressed with the kinds of jobs that were currently available. I asked him, half joking and certainly without any expectation of a positive response, "Could you get me a job in China?" He replied that actually the company he was working for had recently asked if anyone knew of someone with teaching experience who would like to work in a school that still had a space available for the upcoming academic year. And so I sent over my CV, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Behind me is the most famous temple and pagoda in the city. In the first week that I came to the city, I actually went all the way to the top, and I decided to sit on the little wall so that I could get a good picture. Now, I'm not scared of heights at all, but I have to admit I was quite nervous. And looking back on it, it was probably a pretty stupid idea, because I could have quite easily fallen off. But still, I got a good picture, so I guess it was worth it in the end.
There are other stories I could tell about how I ended up going to China, and like the ones I've just told, they would all be true. So perhaps you can see why the question, "Why did you come to China?" is such a difficult one for me to answer. What I can say for sure though, is that I'm very glad that I went to China, and I'm also very glad that I spent my first year in Anqing. Anqing is not the kind of place that foreigners usually live or even visit when they go to China. They usually go to places like Shanghai, Beijing, or Shenzhen. But far from being a negative, I actually saw that as a positive thing. I enjoyed being in a place that had been less impacted by international culture and had almost no other foreigners, as it made it easy for me to truly immerse myself in local life. What's more, I found Anqing people to be not only friendly and welcoming, but also down to earth and easy to get along with. This made my stay there very enjoyable. Finally, I loved the food. I know that great food can be found across the whole of China, but for me, the meaty, bready dishes common in Anqing cuisine suited my taste. And the fact that Anqing cuisine is so varied meant that I never got bored. I've travelled widely across China, but Anqing will always hold a special place in my heart, and I hope to keep coming back to visit the city regularly. If you want to see more videos about running in interesting places in China, the UK and elsewhere, then subscribe to the channel. If you've already done that, thank you. Why not consider sharing this video with someone else that you think would enjoy it?
That's it, I finished my run. In the end, the route was about 15.5 kilometers. I really enjoyed this trip down memory lane, and I hope you enjoyed it too. 下次再见。